Welcome, and thank you to our audience for joining us for the panel Bolivia on the Brink, Natural Resources, the War on Drugs, and the Future of Democracy, organized by Brown War Watch and generously hosted by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Watson Institute here at Brown University. The discussion today will be held in English. Lo siento, mi español es horrible, pero si prefieres escuchar en español, si puedes hacer esa selección. Today, we are joined by two esteemed panelists and Bolivian experts. Catherine Ledeber is the director of the Cochabamba-based policy think tank, the Andean Information Network, and a visiting research fellow at the University of Reading, UK. She's a leading expert on international drug policy in Latin America, human rights, and alternative coca and drug control strategy and cultural needs of Bolivia. She's been a clear-eyed commentator since the 1990s and has followed the rise of Morales and MAS from its earliest inception through her work on coca and drug policy in Bolivia. Thank you for joining us, Catherine.
Thank you so much for having me.
Bret Gustafson is an associate professor of sociocultural anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Gustafson's work focuses on the anthropology of politics and the political, with a particular interest in Latin American social movements, state transformation, and the politics of development. His research has engaged indigenous movements in both Bolivia and Guatemala. He's the author of the very recently published Bolivia in the Age of Gas by Duke University Press, just out in recent months. In this new book, Gustafson explores how the struggle over natural gas has reshaped Bolivia, along with the rise and ultimate fall of the country's first indigenous-led government. Though grounded in the unique complexities of Bolivia, the volume argues that fossil fuel political economies worldwide are central to the reproduction of militarism and racial capitalism. His first book, New Languages of the State, Indigenous Resurgence and the Politics of Knowledge in Bolivia, was also published by Duke University Press. He's published widely in peer-reviewed journals, including Latin American Perspectives, Anthropological Quarterly, and the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. Thank you for joining us, Bret. And a special thanks to both our panelists for joining us so close to the Bolivian election, now just 5 days away. My name is Les Robinson, he, him pronouns. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of History here at Brown and co-president of Brown War Watch. For those who are unfamiliar with our group, Brown War Watch is the anti-war and peace activist group on Brown campus. For those eager to hear more about our work, you can reach out directly to us by email, brownwarwatch@brown.edu. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and at our website, brownwarwatch.com. This semester, we're meeting at 7 p.m. on Tuesday nights, and all political persuasions and religious beliefs are welcome, united by the quest to build a more peaceful world, dismantle the profligate war machine, and raise awareness about conflicts around the world and rising tensions between the world's superpowers. This semester, we are focusing particularly on the intersection of militarism and other injustices, whether racial, economic, or climate, amongst others. So before beginning the panel today, in which we explore some of the ramifications of long-term and ongoing colonizations and imperialisms in Bolivia, I would like to acknowledge that I am moderating from the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Narragansett. Further, and to state clearly, Brown War Watch understands that the violence of colonization of North and South America is not relegated to the past, but is an ongoing lived reality for the Indigenous members of our society here and there. Our efforts in the name of peace cannot be realized without justice for them. The plan for today's panel is to proceed in 3 broad segments before turning to your questions, audience questions. Please, throughout, if you come up with a question or please post them to the Q&A section and we'll get to them. In the first section, we will develop the historical currents. In the second, we'll unpack the Morales presidency. And in the third, we'll look at the events from October and November last year, the year that has passed, and the prospects for the election. And the challenges any new government will face in the future. We hope to leave ample time for the audience questions. So before we begin a deeper dive into the Bolivian story, perhaps for those members of our audience who don't know Bolivia very well, it might serve us to paint a concise picture of the key social, economic, and political dynamics of the country, including its racial politics and terms of self-identification. So as I turn to our panelists for that brief introduction, I might also ask that our panelists offer a brief glimpse at our third segment and ask you to lay out just briefly the stakes of affairs in Bolivia today, why spotlighting Bolivia is so critical at this moment, and the need to keep the events in Bolivia at the forefront of our minds. So Catherine, could I ask you to give us a brief introduction of Bolivia for the uninitiated and to lay out for us some of the stakes in the ground right there, right now?
Thanks so much. Bolivia has a long history as being known as the poorest nation in South America. It has one of the highest indigenous populations of any Latin American country, along with Guatemala. And it was longest and best known for being most dependent on US economic assistance. And as a result, most susceptible to US economic pressures and policy impositions. And one of those key impositions has shifted over time. It's interesting to note, and I think Bret will go much more in depth into the issues of natural resources, that Bolivia, since the Spanish colonization, has been largely dependent on, for its external economy, one sole export crop. Initially silver, later tin. And at this point in time, in spite of a lot of economic transformations that happened during the Morales administration in the preceding 14 years, we still have a dependency on natural gas and income from natural gas to fuel Bolivia's economy, or to fuel the bulk of Bolivia's export economy. So it's a country that has faced many economic challenges, a great deal of political instability. Bolivia has had more presidents in a shorter period of time than any other Latin American government. We have had a return to democracy in 1982 after a series of right-wing coups and military dictatorships in conjunction and supported by the United States through Plan Condor, and a period of what I would call brokered democracy, of political parties, not necessarily traditional political parties, not necessarily with any political affiliation, but dividing up the spoils of the state and access to key resources and control of key areas of the government, which basically had led for a very long time to a state that was insensitive to the needs of the bulk of its population, very unresponsive to the needs of indigenous people, a great deal of racism. And although there had been legislative advances, really hindered by these impediments. It's interesting to note that Bolivia did have a revolution that was then followed by a 1953 agrarian reform, which restructured landholding in the lowlands, but in the highlands, but not in the lowlands. And an evolution of Bolivia, democracy through periods of dependence or involvement with both coca production, which has been traditional throughout Bolivia's history, cocaine production, and a great deal of US policy imposition and violent repression based on the war on drugs and a poorly placed US policy tied to US funding. That changed during the Morales administration, where we saw advances in coca policy, a growing economic pie with investment in low-income sectors, social programs, health and education, a renationalization of state industries, and a series of democratic challenges that came along with it.
Thank you. That was very helpful. Bret, would you like to build on that or add anything that that perhaps you think contributes to what's at stake at the moment?
Yes, and thank you for the invitation. I think Catherine did a great job of laying out the context. A lot has been said about natural resources like natural gas, and in the context of the current moment, the question of lithium. And I think it's worth emphasizing that Evo Morales and the MAS were not as radical as many of their detractors said. It was never quite really a socialist system. Certainly many of the public utilities were nationalized. Portions of the oil and gas industry were renationalized, but a significant amount, actually financially speaking, the majority of the gas industry was still operated largely by private foreign companies, primarily from Spain, Brazil, and Argentina. So it's important to recognize that this was, relatively speaking, a moderate political project to do what even the World Bank says companies with a lot of natural gas or oil should do, and that is to take most of the profit. Because companies that invest in gas or oil potentially generate super profits that under no logical reason should that money be repatriated to Wall Street or to Brazil, as the case may be. So this isn't to take away what Evo and the MAS did. It's just to kind of look at it quite reasonably. This wasn't a radical expropriation of foreign property. That happened earlier in the century. It was a quite modest project. And as Catherine said, you know, without saying that there were no flaws or no corruption, the government also managed that wealth quite well. At one point, they had more money in the bank, I think, in proportion to GDP than even China. In other words, they saved foreign reserves. They used public spending to maintain economic growth. And they did a pretty good job of redistribution, with poverty levels decreasing and other indices improving. All of this is worth recognizing now that the right wing is attempting to basically destroy the image of Evo Morales and the MAS and returning to a sort of crude racist idioms to do so. So that's what I would say about natural gas. I'm sure we can come back to lithium going forward. The other sort of elephant in the room is soy. But as Catherine said, the one of, I guess, several limitations that you might observe coming out of 14 years of the MAS is that despite the advances, there was relatively little effort to drastically transform that underlying structure of an export-dependent economy. And so within that lies the trap.
Thank you, Bret. Okay, well, we might dig a little deeper on this history and sort of mine, pardon the pun, if mine both your areas of expertise. So in this first segment, we'll explore the history and the longue durée currents of outstanding importance, especially those that contributed to the advent of and the rise of mass and the movement towards socialism, or mass as we call them for shorthand, and the Morales presidency. Currents that indeed continued to shape Morales's presidency, which we'll tackle a little more in that second segment. So Bret, we'll stay with you because just having read your book, this is Bret's new book, Bolivia in the Age of Gas, a little plug for our panelists there. I sense your genealogy of the present moments may stretch back a little further than Catherine's. So your new book constructs a long history of oil and gas politics in Bolivia. In your introductory chapter, and I'll read just a section here, it says, in combining an ethnography of the Bolivian state with a critique of US imperial history, part of your purpose is to help North American readers understand the problem of fossil capital and fossil fuel dependence in the United States as well as Bolivia. This is not only because of concerns about climate change, which are obviously critical, but because of the ways that fossil fuel political economies are central to the reproduction of patriarchal and racial capitalism and the militarization of social life. Fossil fuel economies generate multiform toxicities that are arrayed against our own bodies as well as the ecological system. So might you outline for us some of the key arguments and the key events why Bolivian history can be understood through fossil fuel political economies, with a particular sensitivity to how natural gas is intertwined with nationalisms of both the left and the right, militarism and intervention, leading up to the Morales presidency.
It's a bit of a tall order. It took me 200 and some odd pages to do that. But since we're in a room full of historians, well, I see it in the Bolivian case as a paradox. And the fundamental paradox that I see in the Bolivian case is that oil first and then gas have long been central to the production of a left popular national ideology, that resources belong to the people, whether it's tin, silver, oil, or gas, but in particular, oil and gas as early as the 1920s, in the lead up to the Chaco War, and in the aftermath of the Chaco War, oil and later gas became the kind of central anchor for thinking about a leftist, national, popular, revolutionary project in Bolivia. And that sentiment is still strong today. So that's sort of one side of the longer history, is that as with other countries in Latin America, Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Argentina, somewhat to a lesser extent, but Ecuador certainly, government control over fossil fuel resources was seen as a revolutionary objective. And the redistribution of the wealth from those resources was seen as a key to sovereignty and the making of a revolutionary project. Now I say, and this struggle has sort of swung back and forth on a pendulum from nationalization in the late 1930s to reprivatization in the 50s and 60s, back briefly to a nationalist turn in 70, 71, and then to the period of military coups through the 80s, and into the neoliberal era, and then with Evo was shifted back to a more nationalist perspective in the current moment. But at any rate, I say it's a paradox because even during the moments in which a left-leaning government managed to wield some power, and those moments have been fleeting in Bolivia, we're just talking about a question of months or a year or two, the vision of national, popular, revolutionary transformation, I think, was ultimately undermined by the nature of fossil fuel political economies, which centralize wealth, siphon off wealth for the military, which has long been the unreliable ally of popular movements. And in the case of indigenous peoples, virtually, polluted, but also drastically transformed the social and infrastructural landscape of southeastern Bolivia, where I work, subjecting indigenous peoples to dispossession, marginalization, in the case of women's sexual violence from oil workers. And the oil workers' unions themselves were sort of an aristocratic labor elite that were detached from the revolutionary project of the miners. So this is the fundamental paradox I see with the fossil fuel political economy. Slightly different in the age of gas, but at the end of the day, we might be seeing that it's not that different, that it was unable to usher in sovereignty or a deeply socialist transformative project because of its political, economic, and we should add now ecological characteristics. That's sort of how I see the big fossil fuel picture, and I'll stop there.
I might ask you just to clarify for our audience just one more point. And how has sort of gas structured or enhanced and encouraged an important regionalism in Bolivia? How has that sort of set the different regions against each other, which we see playing out, including in this election coming up?
Well, ever since the oil period, which went from the 30s up through the 70s, the regionalist elites of Santa Cruz mobilized in the 50s, as early as the 50s, to demand a set percentage, the 11% it's called, demand the 11% for the producing region. Oil companies promoted this because oil companies worldwide do not like strong national governments. They like a weak national government, and they like alliances with local regional elites. That 11% meant that wherever you found oil or later gas, and it was modified slightly in the age of Evo, but not drastically, meant that regions where the gas was found benefited more. More money, more of the rents, as we call it, public monies would circulate to those regions. Despite the fact that they may be relatively unpopulated, like Tarija in the south, which has very few people and a lot of money, and Santa Cruz in the east, which has its fair share of people, but not a lot of poverty. A more radical idea would be to distribute the rents according to poverty levels or something like that. But the distribution of gas wealth is regionally skewed. So it's in the interests of regional elites to maintain that system of skewed distribution. Evo Morales and the MAS did their best to whittle away at that, to break down, to channel monies in other directions, to create oppositional spaces like the Chaco. But that underlying structure and that longer characteristic, which you can see the world over. In Iraq, for a time, there were people proposing to break off Kurdistan just so that the oil companies could do their business without being without having to deal with the central government of Iraq. So this is there's a long history behind regionalism and fossil fuel companies, and Bolivia is no exception.
Thank you, Bret. So, Catherine, I will pose the same question to you, but with the focus on your area of expertise. So how has the Bolivian history leading up to the Morales election been shaped by coca and cocaine and narco-trafficking economies, with a particular attention to militarism and foreign intervention?
Thank you. I think it's interesting to note that, and it's something that's commonly known that coca has always been grown in Bolivia. It's It's basically a staple in the Bolivian rural diet and also for Bolivian transportation workers. It has key medicinal properties and a role, and was a key part of Bolivian society, and only questioned by the Inquisition, the Catholic Church arriving when they wanted to root out every representation of indigenous religions. And we don't see this attack on the coca leaf until we see the rise of the drug trade and cocaine production, originally brought to Bolivia and use of Bolivia by Colombian drug traffickers. It's really interesting to note that this period in time where there's a growth of the drug trade in Bolivia, originally externally controlled, is the same period of time where you see a growth in hydrocarbons in the lowlands and a growth of Santa Cruz during the Banzer dictatorship. Banzer, a dictator from the Santa Cruz region, that invested, a lot of money, and hydrocarbons exploitation began, but simultaneously the illegal drug trade. And, Bolivian drug barons are the stuff of legends and tawdry movies. But the situation is very, very different for coca farmers in several key regions of the country, the La Paz Yungas and the Trópico de Cochabamba, the Chapare, which is a lowland region between Santa Cruz and Cochabamba. And those farmers were largely migrants from other regions. The indigenous populations in those regions, the Yuquis, the Yuracares, and others were also subject to the migration of Aymaras and Quechuas as a result of structural adjustments imposed by the IMF that led to the mass firing of miners, to drought, to other programs that really pushed rural populations and mining populations into these areas, originally facilitated by the U.S. Alliance for Progress as kind of a depository for excess population. And the only thing that grew there, or the thing that grew best and that had the largest market, was the coca leaf. It's only after the Garcia Mesa dictatorship in the early 80s, a dictatorship that basically ran the drug trade in close connection with traffickers, where the US begins to identify that simultaneously they have a crack problem, and that this is a good political way to maintain intervention in Bolivia. With the ending of the Cold War, with the ending of the war against communism and anti-guerrilla movements, the United States needed a new war. And Bolivia was a prime example of a country where the economic and political elite perceived that US funding was the key way to maintain dominance. And as a result, this became the key linchpin for US intervention in Bolivia. This dictation of the war on drugs, and a focus initially on drug interdiction, which is something that failed miserably with the intervention of US Special Forces in Operation Blast Furnace without the authorization of the Congress. They were able to totally disrupt the Bolivian drug trade for about 11 days. Which kind of points to the futile focus on drug interdiction through the military or through police forces with military training, something that's very traditional in the US perspective, that you're externally mixing the mandates of the security forces and the military, and you're pitting them against each other, something that's really had a very toxic effect in Bolivian modern history. This US interventionism, the establishment of a certification system, the stigmatization of coca farmers, specifically in the Chapare region, led to a great deal of human rights violations and repression of farmers, and then eventually a focus in the mid-90s on forced eradication, which basically ripped out the family's sole source of income and conditioned alternative development programs, which would perhaps give families income in 8 years or 2 years, and nothing in the meantime was a viable means for them to eat. It's something that doesn't work. It's something that never worked. It's something that's still being touted in Peru, in Colombia, and by the Áñez government. it's interesting to note that a shift under the Morales administration, and also it's interesting, Evo Morales says a lot of things, but the one thing I think he did say, which was quite poignant, is that the US was his campaign manager, that these cycles of unrelenting US pressure that pushed low-income cocoa growers below the subsistence point, which led to cyclical protests, human rights violations, and the use of the military against civilian populations outside of the Chapare region, really was something that led Evo Morales to come to power, and almost an unexpected come to power after extreme violence on the part of traditional parties, especially the massacre of 69 Bolivians in El Alto in 2003 over the gas war and the exportation of natural gas, which I will pass back to Bret because it's his forte. But I wanted to add that the transformation under Morales, and Morales had made many mistakes and had many errors, but this focus on coca farmers and coca as a subsistence need led to a shift in policy where coca farmers voluntarily limited their crops. The price of coca for the legal crop became incredibly high. In the last year Morales' government, it was 9 times higher than the price of the leaf in Colombia, for example. And it allowed Bolivia to dramatically reduce the extension of coca crop, which is ostensibly the goal of the international community, in an effort to reduce the illicit production of cocaine, while at the same time providing subsistence for coca farmers. I think without assistance based on on basic needs and other programs, being linked to forced eradication. So that is a model that had made a great deal of progress, but something that has been completely overturned by the interim government.
Thank you, Catherine. I think we can maybe unpack that a little more, the advances in drug control under the Morales administration. I think you pointed to something that we might just quickly move back to Bret regarding, because I wanted to sort of address Bolivia's relationship briefly with its neighbors, and you pointed to the gas wars, which sort of centered antagonisms with Chile. But Bret also sort of pointed earlier to which I don't think a lot of people understand, the outsized role of Brazil in Bolivian politics. So Bret, do you want to speak for a moment on Brazil's role in Bolivia and the sort of long history of antagonisms with Chile?
Sure, I can say a little bit. Basically, Bolivia has always been stuck between 3 large, powerful neighbors: Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. Peru as well, but those are the sort of 3 that have had their eyes on Bolivian hydrocarbon resources. Brazil and Argentina first, later Chile. So without making a long story too long, the plan of the United States from the early 20th century was for Latin American hydrocarbons to flow to the north, to the United States, under the control of the United States. Bolivia's first export pipeline went across the Andes, across Chile, and that oil was shipped to the north by Gulf Oil Company. Gulf found gas. Gas is not as profitable at long distances. This was prior to the days of liquefied natural gas. So the only way that Gulf could get its gas out of the country profitably was to export it to Argentina or Brazil. So there's long been talk, we're talking in the 1960s, there's long been talk of building pipelines to Brazil and building pipelines to Argentina. But there's also been tension between Argentina's national oil company and Brazil's national oil company and the interests of US private oil companies like Gulf. So again, without getting too deep into the weeds of all of this, the discussion about pipelines never really materialized until finally the World Bank paid for one to go to Argentina. This was before the Banzer coup. The project started. They got investors, including the New York State Teachers Pension Fund was going to invest in that one. Then the Banzer coup happened. The New York teachers, for their part, got a little nervous and they backed out. But the World Bank, as soon as Banzer took over, went in and signed it. Robert McNamara, the architect of the Vietnam War, happened to be the president of the World Bank at the time. So, of course, he wasn't concerned about the fact that Banzer spilled a lot of blood to come into power. So that first gas pipeline was built basically, and as Catherine said, this was the rise of coca and cocaine, and the rise of gas was actually in the 70s. And this basically enriched Eastern Bolivia, AKA Santa Cruz. For Brazil's part, there was always tension with the Brazilian workers' union. They didn't want competition with Petrobras, Brazil's oil company. Banzer pushed for a pipeline, never got it. The pipeline finally materialized during the neoliberal period. And the sort of sweet spot of convergence that came together was that by the time Evo was elected, the gas pipeline to Brazil was in operation, and Lula was in Brazil, and Chavez was in Venezuela. So you had, and the Kirchners were in Argentina, and Correa was in Ecuador. So you had a cosmic convergence of oil-wealthy, ostensibly left-leaning governments that brought Brazil and Bolivia into a really, a political alliance. But just for the record, back to the paradox, that pipeline had always been pushed by the military dictatorship of Brazil and the military dictatorship of Bolivia, but they just couldn't ever get it done. And I say in the book, the only thing that managed to get gas exported from Bolivia without too much social conflict was the election of Evo Morales. It would never have worked under a neoliberal project. You had to have the nationalist discourse. Now that Brazil has shifted back into a land of insanity and Chavez is gone and Bolivia is becoming isolated, it's not surprising that the right wing wants to take back control over that export apparatus.
Thank you, Bret. That painted a really helpful picture of Bolivia's relationship to its neighbors. Okay, so let's move on to the next segment, and we turn to the rise of the movement towards socialism, or MAS, the Morales presidency. Catherine has already done some of that excellent work there in sort of building up the sort of forces, and of course Bret's eye on gas, the gas wars in 2003, I believe. So the Morales presidency and its negotiation of these long-term struggles and contestations within the country. So Catherine, you've watched the rise and then the fall of Morales presidency up close, emerging out of the coca leaf growers union in your home department of Cochabamba onto the national and then the international stage. His political persona perhaps flattened of its complexities by his admirers and detractors on the international stage, and warped by his opposition and his supporters alike at home. But what have been the critical moments and the defining events of the Morales presidency for you, and what have been the sort of successes and limitations of Marcel Morales in power, the promise and then the lived realities? Big question, but do your best, of course.
One of the defining moments is the full adoption of this progressive coca program, something that was piloted under the Mesa government. But I think there were other key issues that really marked changes. One was, the recall referendum, where there was a movement on the part of the opposition to have his term revoked, something that failed miserably. I think it was an interesting dynamic with advantages and disadvantages of this largely grassroots party that began with different social movements branching out from the coca growers, and a pre-electoral coalition of these diverse groups with sometimes contradictory or conflicting interests, and the evolution of that over a 14-year period into a political party with bureaucratic party structures, with shifts in accountabilities to the different social movements, the grassroots that fueled MAS, the incorporation of the middle class, a growing middle class, and its shifting view towards MAS, initially largely supportive, and then gradually over time as Morales was reelected and eventually as he ran for a fourth term, which is not permitted under the Bolivian Constitution, a large disaffection of this middle class, a generation of MAS supporters, or a generation of Bolivians that had grown up in a period of relative economic stability, of relative peace and privilege, which really changes the perspective of the younger generation from those that remember dictatorships or drug war intervention, hyperinflation, and economic hardship, and US dependency. I think there were key moments in terms of the US intervention and the Media Luna movement to succeed from the Union, something that where there was clear US intervention, and a movement to have an uprising where the military were supposed to support these lowland elites, and the lowland elites are Bret's area of expertise, although not his personal preference. But this divisive movement where there was a key shift, where the US ambassador was expelled, the DEA was expelled, this movement for autonomy was basically dismantled, and you saw a shift in the position of the lowland elites and the way that they adjusted their position vis-a-vis Morales. A pulling out of US funding, eventually all US funding ended. There was a later expulsion of USAID, and all US funding ended in 2013 in Bolivia. And this very, very interesting dynamic where a country that had previously been perceived as fully dependent on US aid, economic assistance, and obedience to US policy discourses, now no longer with any US economic assistance, with no direct role of US and ability to engage the government in political regions, and really, you know, an economic growth based on an unstable model, as Bret says, but a kind of busting of the myth of the role of the US as an arbiter of policy and the need to engage directly with the US. And so I think those were kind of key moments. And then another defining moment, I would think, would be the decision to run for, well, the intervention of the Tipnis March, you know, a kind of shift where the Morales, the new Congress, I mean, the new constitution has stipulated prior consultation for indigenous groups. Yet one hand of the MAS government signed a deal with Brazil for the construction of a highway through the Tipnis protected area, which is bordering the Chapari region and going through Tibini, a region that's largely isolated, but in clear contradiction with the stated policy, with clear contradiction of the stated pro-indigenous goals of the government, and a violent security forces intervention of what was a largely peaceful march, which kind of put in our faces the contradictions that can arise when a government like MAS has been in power for such a long time.
Thank you. The Tipnis March, of course, being 2011. Just as a follow-up, and you've sort of mentioned this before, how did the regulation of coca and cocaine eradication programs sort of change under Morales, and was that a source of the changing relationship with the US?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think the first schism with the US was the forced resignation of Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, who, you know, his nickname's a gringo. He speaks with very heavily accented Spanish and heavily accented English. but that began this first separation, but not a drastic separation with the U.S. And I think Mesa did very many things to try to regain U.S. approval. But one of these things was based on the gross human rights violations that occurred during forced eradication, as you know very well, because you collaborated with us on kind of mapping the gross human rights violations with the level of forced eradication, and there's a direct correlation. So this idea, after the killing of coca growers in the Tipnis region, or in a coca growing region bordering Tipnis, the Mesa government acceded to this idea of 1,600 square meters for subsistence, and that became the cornerstone of Morales's program. I think that, you know, Morales, as a coca grower leader, understood coca growing very, very well. He understood the dynamics. He understood the economic need, and he built a cadre of public officials and technicians that were also coca growers and understood the dynamics. They had meetings in Quechua. They came up with a very pragmatic approach, which was supported by the European Union, which became a counterpart to the US. And the US found that increasingly it couldn't engage on topics that really had been so corrosive to Bolivian sovereignty, to Bolivian politics. You know, this idea that, you know, there was a sole policy focus on the drug war and coca and stigmatization of the coca growers is something that had diminished in Bolivia, and there was a wider view of policy, as it should be, but something that has arisen again in the campaign that forced Morales out before the end of his third term, and certainly something that has been used by the far right and the current government to stigmatize coca growers, to refocus the idea of narcos and guerrillas in the coca producing region, when actually the drug trafficking and the large portion of drug trafficking happens in other areas, in Santa Cruz, the economic portion, in Beni for air transport, and all through the rest of the country. So this message, once the US congressional aide told me, you know, we found out with the US that the emperor has no clothes. And these shifts in policy based on the killing of coca growers, you know, has led to this dramatic change. But there was a thread of a good example and a lot of opposition externally to this alternative model, because it was more cost efficient, it was based on subsistence, and it really worked. And I think, you know, you can't underestimate the international organizations and consultancies where you want to do alternative development and have one contract after another, or you want to have forced eradication where you engage the military and provide them with funding. It's interesting to note that one of the key weaknesses of this program, I think, is that Morales kept the military in as a vehicle of forced eradication, although human rights violations diminished dramatically. What you see, and this is going to be one of the points that really Morales waffled and that helped bring his downfall, is this reliance on the Bolivian armed forces, or this recreation of their role, which led to a dependence on them that then, when they turned against him, they were unable to sustain.
Thank you, Catherine. So, Bret, I'll ask you the same question. What have been the critical moments that have defined the Morales presidency for you, and what have been the successes and limitations of Mas and Morales in power, the promised and the lived realities? And you might like to sort of fall back on how natural gas has shaped his presidency and Mas in power, to continue that thread.
Sure. Well, without repeating what Catherine said, I mean, I think in the context of natural gas, the success, limited as it was in pushing back against the sort of giveaway of Bolivian resources. I say limited because, against what people farther to the left would have liked, it was not an outright expropriation. It did not involve the absolute government takeover of the industry, and it maintained dependence on foreign capital networks tied to the fossil fuel industry. As I said before, Spain and Brazil chief among them. And even though it was Petrobras is virtually, it's a half private, half government company whose shares trade on Wall Street. So the limitations of that have been deeply discussed in that once the initial reserves started to decline, like all fossil fuel dependent governments, the government had to walk back some of its policies to try to encourage more foreign private investment. And among those policies that got walked back were things like prior consultation for indigenous peoples, giving indigenous peoples a chance to at least modify the way a project was going to happen or get compensation. All of those rights were weakened. For those concerned with the fact that the government had not taken complete control, we saw other policies that were aimed at allowing the companies to take more profit to encourage them to keep investing. So that goes back to that initial paradox I've seen, and which we see in Venezuela now, is that it just doesn't, doesn't seem likely to generate some revolutionary transformation that's dependent on the fossil fuel economy. So that's in the area of natural gas specifically. The other area that I would mention, limits or achievements and limits, was tied to land reform and indigenous autonomy. The case of indigenous autonomy, the Constitution allowed for indigenous autonomy, but it was very much watered down. A colleague of mine, Fernando Garces, has a great piece in a volume we did back in 2011 called Remapping Bolivia. Basically, it's called the domestication of indigenous autonomy. So despite the fact that many people in the MAS were very much thinking about radically transforming the geographic makeup of the state, seeing that geographic makeup as fundamental to its colonial nature. The idea was that you had to dismantle the colonial form of the state and recreate a new kind of state. Garcia Linera and his circle were very much about this intellectual project, at least on paper. But what happened in practice with the recentering of political parties as the core of power and the weakening of social movements, the program for indigenous autonomy was also weakened, to the point where the only possibility for indigenous autonomy is if you happen to have a majority in a municipality to vote to make a municipality autonomous, which goes against the idea that what a lot of indigenous movements were hoping for was doing away with those old colonial borders and rethinking the borders of territories and so forth. So that whole project was greatly weakened. There are 2 or 3 areas that have managed to vote for indigenous autonomy, but that just fizzled out. In terms of land reform, in terms of more conventional redistribution of land to the poor, there were great aspirations for that, and there were certainly revolutionary thinkers in the MAS, in the agrarian office, in the agrarian ministry. For a time, the sort of head proponent of land reform was Alejandro Almaraz, whose father was Sergio Almaraz, who was the intellectual behind the nationalization of oil in the 60s. So you had really ideologically committed figures in the land reform office, but that too, once the conflicts with Santa Cruz came to a head, the MAS came out on top. Rather than produce more conflict by pushing for more land reform, for reasons that are still not altogether clear to me, the MAS put on the brakes. Said, okay, we're not going to push for any more land reform. You stop trying to, chill out with the regionalist secession movement, and we'll just have a détente. So there was a trade-off to maintain power, that the main sacrifice of which was a radical redistribution of land, or any deep dismantling of the soy agro-industrial complex, soy and cattle, I should say. Soy, cattle, and sugar, but soy and cattle agro-industrial complex of Eastern Bolivia. So those are 2 limits from the perspective of land that I would point to.
Thank you, Bret. And in fact, I think you've provided a good segue into the final segment, which is turning to the events of October 2019 election and what many people see as a subsequent coup, the end of the Morales presidency, and the conditions in Bolivia under the unelected Áñez caretaker government, especially her management of the COVID crisis. And then, of course, the upcoming election on October 18th in 5 short days. So sort of leading into that, I might sort of get you to pick up, Catherine, on how some of the sort of the social movement aspect of the Morales sort of coalition started to fall apart and what sort of led to sort of a close election result. But can you offer the audience, Catherine, your view on the events of this past year and the upcoming election, sort of this sort of final thoughts sort of segment on, and how serious are the threats currently to Bolivian democracy?
It's been a very dramatic year here. It's been the electoral process and the audit of the October election was highly questionable. It's very interesting because you had the right calling fraud several months before the election. They're also calling out fraud again. It's very interesting that the Bolivian right playbook and the Donald Trump playbook, share many parallels. There's going to be fraud. We're not going to accept the results. And, clearly Morales run for a 4th term is not legally justified, but it's not clear that he didn't win the popular vote in the first round in the last election. I mean, this is something that we probably will never know. But it's interesting to note that when the post-electoral conflict let loose and the OAS offered to do an audit, that Morales agreed to the terms, but the Bolivian right did not. Although they had been calling for fraud, although their supporters had burned down more than half of the state electoral courts in the different departments, and that Morales had agreed to respect the outcome of this audit. And when the audit came back prematurely as social protest increased, Morales immediately announced new elections. And at that point in time, the Bolivian right upped the pressure, upped the popular protest, attacked Mas supporters, and forced him to resign before the end of his democratically elected 3rd term. So whatever you think of Morales and your opinion of him, he was to serve until January 22nd, 2020, and that did not occur. And what we had in the interim, it was interesting to note that Morales had refused to take the armed forces out onto the streets. Although there was spiraling conflict and death of protesters, largely Mas protesters, but violence also from Mas supporters against the other side. But immediately the day after his resignations, the armed forces went out on the street of Bolivia, and there were an unprecedented number of Bolivians shot that very same day and killed. And the subsequent, and a day after that, the self-appointment of Janine Áñez Chavez, whose party had only gained 4% in the presidential elections with no constitutional mandate. And after a quick meeting with the ambassador of the European Union, the Catholic Church, civic officials, and other representatives, she just appointed herself in front of an empty chamber with the support of elites, with the support of the military, and with the support of the Bolivian police. And this self-appointment led to really a green light in the escalation of gross human rights violations, a key role in a lack of oversight, actually a supreme decree that allowed the security forces to fire into crowds and illegally guaranteed them impunity. And we saw what we haven't seen in Bolivia since 2003, and something that was quite atypical. 3 days after she took power, a massacre of Chapari cocoa growers in Sacaba, 10 people killed, over 100 with bullet wounds. And then 3 days after that, another massacre in Sincata around the natural gas plant, which was a key area of protests in 2003. So we see, and with very little outcry from the international community, almost an immediate kudos from the Trump administration and from Mike Pompeo for this highly irregular behavior. a very rapid acceptance and recognition of the Áñez government on the part of Canada, the European Union, and other key actors, and really a silence on the part of the international community as human rights violations spiraled, as journalists were attacked, as immediately the new cabinet said they were going to seek out foreign and seditious journalists. They were moving against community radio stations. There was mass detentions of MAS officials and MAS party members, no due process, no rule of law, no respect for the Bolivian constitution, and a very key role for the military and the security forces. And so we're at a point where this government that was initially going to stay 3 months and call for elections, and we've had an experience in Bolivia in 2005 with Eduardo Rodriguez Velce, where he basically just called elections. But we have a kind of vengeance against MAS, a dismantling of the government bureaucracy, a reshifting of agencies, a change in the personnel of all the government institutions, and renegotiations to privatize state industry in a very, very short period of time, paired with very poor management of the COVID pandemic, widespread corruption, and a constant postponement of the elections. And this other very worrying dynamic of these parastate groups, the long-standing, and Bret knows more about the Santa Cruz Youth League, but their traditional salute is the Nazi salute. And we have a motorcycle gang, a parastate motorcycle gang in Cochabamba, the Cochabamba Youth Resistance, that also led very racist attacks against protesters, threats, and this in conjunction with the Bolivian government. They were rewarded by Áñez, given motorcycles, plaques, with this, very violent action of parastate groups. And it's very troubling that they remain key actors and that there's no discourse in the campaigns for the upcoming election about what to do about those groups, about what to do with the gross human rights violations, and where we go on from here.
Thank you, especially for bringing to our attention those who lost their lives in these gross human rights violations. Critical because of the risk of further violence with the upcoming election. So Bret, I'll ask you the same question. Can you offer the audience your view of the events of this past year in the upcoming election, and how serious do you perceive the threats currently to Bolivian democracy?
Well, I think Catherine summed it up quite well. I can't add very much. I do want to emphasize something that Catherine said about the technique of the massacre, which is something that has long been part of the governance strategy of the neoliberal right. During the dictatorships, during the Gonzalo Sanchez regime, during the massacre of 2003. A few days before that happened, they did a similar legal maneuver to try to give blanket legal coverage to the military officers. And again, paradoxically, they did it in the name of protecting gasoline supplies. This decree that the Áñez government emitted basically was a license to kill. And a few days after the killing stopped, they revoked the decree. And that's criminal. And you say what you will about Evo and the MAS, but we certainly didn't see anything like that kind of state violence with impunity that we saw in less than a week or so after the coup. So they're going, not to keep going back to the past, but the Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada trial is still being litigated in U.S. courts. And one of the things that, if we had any hope for justice left over after surviving the Trump era, we might hope that we'll see some justice for what happened after the Áñez coup. I just want to put that out there on the one hand. Nonetheless, the scenario is very difficult. The motorcycle groups that Catherine's referring to represent an expansion of a Santa Cruz-based logic of street violence to Cochabamba, something we had not seen before, at least not in that form, of highly organized paramilitary style groups, clearly getting equipment and some sort of orientation and training. That means financing coming from somewhere. The mass movements, for their part, were not really ready for the coup. They weren't mobilized, but there are some signs that they might be mobilized. It's a different kind of mobilization. It's more traditional social movement mobilization. It's not this paramilitary type activity. But the point is that the material is there for a political confrontation, and I think that's what many sectors on the right are looking for, whether they call it fraud or you know, if Evo or if the MAS manages to eke out a first round victory, which right now does not look probable, but I should probably not be making predictions. But if the right calls fraud and tries to instigate instability, we could see an attempt to create conditions for the military to step in once again. That's within the realm of possibility. Whichever side wins, the gas boom is largely over. There will be conflict over lithium. There will be motivations on both sides to create a difficult situation of governance, no matter who wins. So the foreseeable future will be difficult, assuming Bolivia gets through the electoral period, 2 rounds of voting. You know, if that actually happens, what comes after that is still going to be quite tendentious. So, sorry, that's not a satisfactory end of the story, but that's how I see it, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. I think I can detect both of you are reluctant to offer us an intellectual prediction, but for our audience, so that they know, in the first round of voting, the candidate needs to clear 40% and win by a margin of 10. And currently polls show Luis Arce, the MAS candidate, with about 43%, and his challenger, former President Carlos Mesa, about between 9 and 12% behind them. So Catherine, I will ask you this one question though. What challenges do you think will the new government face in Bolivia, and what's the likelihood that we might see their abilities to forge something like the stability that Morales was able to achieve at the height of his power?
Well, I think the new government is going to face multiple challenges. I think if we have a MAS government, they're going to still face the attacks from the right. They're going to have the parastate groups. They're going to have the high level of prosecution in an attempt to mobilize the international community against them. You know, it's important to note that during this short period of interim government, they've signed all sorts of commercial agreements with the United States. You can now export US beef and import it into Bolivia. It makes no sense at all. So they're kind of setting the scenes and a trap for MAS if MAS is to come in. At the same time, if the right comes in, it'll be based on an alliance between Carlos Mesa, who bills himself as a moderate, but it's important to note that in 2003, he pulled away from Gonzalo Sanchez because of the massacre and said he couldn't be party to human rights violations. Yet this year, when the massacres occur, he didn't say much. And he hasn't done very much to denounce the irregularities in the Agnes government. And so that will be a marriage that perhaps is uncomfortable, but a marriage of convenience, which means that Agnes's withdrawal from the race is based on, in my assessment, an agreement that they'll get a piece of this brokered democracy pie. And I would assume that a big chunk of that piece is impunity for human rights violations. So, you know, this lack of clarity and, you know, the inability to foresee investigations of human rights violations by a right-wing government, the rejection of the Bolivian armed forces, the high command of a MAS government, because then they're going to go to trial for gross human rights violations. And they certainly, after their undemocratic, unconstitutional behavior, are looking to avoid that. It remains to be seen what the rank and file of the armed forces will do. The police high command is also on the side of the right, but the rank and file are severely divided. So there's a challenge in front of the incoming government. And another challenge is you went into the pandemic and the Morales government ended abruptly and before its time with a relatively stable economic outlook. And you've seen a pandemic, but you've also seen very, very high levels of state corruption, even for respirators and tear gas and weaponry and things that were purchased that had no impact, and a great deal of international economic assistance coming in for COVID. And we don't know where that money is. They've started almost immediately taking out large loans from the International Monetary Foundation. So Bolivia starts this new elected term, if we get there, in a huge financial hole, in terms of democracy and basic human rights. And so even the best intentioned government will have a struggle to pull out. MAS's challenges will be the right, but also accountability and response to the very diverse grassroots that feels less represented by Arce middle class presidential ticket. So it's not clear what's going to happen, but I think it's clear that it's going to be very complicated and messy for a long time from here on out.
Yes, indeed. The financial picture is not looking pretty at all. In part of preparation for this panel, I was looking at what Bret mentioned earlier, the sort of financial reserves, what a nation has to do these days in order to sort of guarantee stability on the financial markets. And they're able to stockpile a good sum of financial reserves, as dollar reserves. But in the last 5 years, they have really burned through those reserves in trying to maintain the dollar peg. So any government that comes to power will have to be and wants to defend that dollar peg, has their work cut out for them, and you'd have to think that they're ripe for a financial coup, if nothing else. To me, it looked like storm clouds were brewing. We have that time now for some audience questions, and we do have some here. And this is, I'll start with a great question, and it's the Gordian knot question, and it's for you, Bret. What could MAS have done differently with regard to fossil fuel extraction and mineral extraction? Is there an alternative economic route? What can just transitions look like for Bolivia, Bret?
If by just transition you're referring to transition to a renewable energy matrix, I think Bolivia has infinite potential in wind, sun, and now with lithium, if they can manage to industrialize the lithium in country rather than export it simply as a raw material. And we didn't really touch on that, but that's the direction that could go in. In terms of what they did do in relationship to fossil fuels, I remember when I was hanging out in the Chaco with friends, and we were all cheering for Evo, and we were cheering for nationalization, and we said, yes, the gas belongs to the people. And I think in the big picture, with the structural constraints that economy places on a country, I think they did as well as they could do with the gas. Now, of course, someone might say, well, you should have taken complete government control. Well, I used to think that, but that it doesn't necessarily lead to a happy outcome to deepen the state dependence on fossil fuels. They certainly could have done a better job with indigenous rights, and certainly could have done a better job with environmental monitoring and things of that nature. But as far as fossil fuels go, it's a dirty business, and there's no real way to get it right, especially in an age of climate change. So what we might have liked to have seen was, instead of building natural gas plants with the idea of exporting energy to Argentina, which has happened, but there's no demand. You've got a big gas plant on the southern border. I think the government could have put a lot more effort into transforming the infrastructure towards a renewable economy. But again, if your money's coming from gas, it's just what we see in the United States. It's called infrastructural lock-in and financial lock-in. You tend to build out more infrastructure to reproduce that relationship of dependence.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question here, perhaps for you, Catherine. What's the relationship between the pre-Morales government and the interim government in power now and the candidates running for the presidency currently?
Well, I think, you know, there are over 100 officials from the previous government either incarcerated or with charges against them by the previous government. So I would say that, you know, there's been an acute political persecution. This is something that, you know, the very not leftist organization Human Rights Watch focused on in its recent report. And so you see a very antagonistic relationship as you know, a pointed attack from the Áñez administration and an attack on the candidates also in the upcoming election. So, you know, we just yesterday had a congressional candidate arrested and charged for violence, although she had been attacked by the Santa Cruz Youth League. We have all the presidential candidate, the vice presidential candidate, all key congressional candidates also have charges against them for sedition, for terrorism, even for genocide, although no one has been killed by the left since Áñez has come to power. And so, you know, it's an antagonistic relationship. It's not a relationship that I see in the short term can be resolved by negotiations or concessions, nor do I perceive, right? And we're really talking about a kind of authoritarian, when you look down the checklist of early warning signs of fascism, we've got all of that. You know, no intent on reconciliation or compromise or moving forward, because that does not appear to be their intention at all.
Okay, Catherine, I'll follow up with another question here from the audience for you. Do you perceive that a Mesa government might mean a return to violent repression of coca growers in the Chapare? And what policy developments would you expect from a Mesa government with regard to narco trafficking?
Well, you know, the Mesa government, you know, one, we have to see if Mesa's going to gut it out. In a situation where he became interim president and he basically had the support of most Bolivians, but not and even MAS, the traditional party structure, he only lasted a year and a half. And so here we are coming into a very tense situation with a candidate that after him, Luis Fernando Camacho, a representative of the Santa Cruz far right and linked to these radical groups. You know, what is the compromise there? And who do we end up with if Mesa wins the election, but he doesn't stay? And in that scenario, we can look at gross human rights violations with forced coca eradication. It's interesting that the interim government shot themselves in the foot as they were engaging in this fantasy that they had that they were going to once again receive $130 million of U.S. counter-drug aid, because, you know, one of the key elements in play here is the Leahy Amendment. In U.S. legislation, if security forces commit gross human rights violations and they don't have appropriate legal consequences in the civilian justice system, they cannot get that anti-drug funding. And it's interesting that this is something that's been very hard to apply in other countries, but in Bolivia, because of the clarity of the situation in the past, it's already been applied twice with prior governments, and it's something that is going to hinder a focus on forced eradication with US funding. And the European Union, the other key funder, although they've made many inappropriate concessions to ANYAs, are not allowed to link their funding to forced eradication. So, you know, they can do it if they want. There'll be a grassroots uprising and a protracted conflict that could bring down their government, and they're going to have to find a way to pay for it, because I don't think they're going to get international funding for it at this point in time.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions that are sort of, I'll push together, and they're sort of around the voting. I have a question about the role of the OAS in the last election, and the voting system, and whether there will be a replacement voting system for the count this time around. If either of you know about the voting system, that would be good. But more broadly, the sort of the count and OAS involvement last time.
I was pointing at you, Catherine. I mean, I can talk about the.
Great at this one.
I can talk about the OAS. This is another great mystery, was why Evo was so eager to invite Almagro of the OAS to observe the elections. You know, if he's going to have, you know, stage a fraud, you would think it would sort of put up obstacles to having the OAS come in. He not only brought him in, but sort of feted Almagro around the country. And then Almagro turned around and oversaw the production of this report, which we now know to be deeply flawed. So that from any reasonable standpoint, it's quite clear that, to me, that the evidence is there to call it a coup. The evidence of that it was electoral fraud is not that clear to me, although I have friends and colleagues on both sides of that fence. But at any rate, the OAS, who was supposed to be the arbiter of that investigation, has been shown by CEPR and other folks, scholars at Tulane, they're doing bad statistics. So I have absolutely they have no credibility to me, the OAS, based on that recent past. Now, as far as the new electoral system, the Electoral Commission has a new head, Salvador Romero, who Catherine, I believe, knows more about where he's coming from. As far as the technological aspect of it, I don't know enough about what might have changed. One of the accusations was that there was a hidden server, or that there was not enough transparency, that the lights were cut. But the pre-count was stalled. But the pre-count is always stalled to shift over to the official count, so that's not really an anomaly. But maybe Catherine can say a bit more about the apparatus of the system and what might be different.
Well, it's not very clear how the apparatus of the system is going to be different. The rapid count is now supposedly a new program with a new name. They're no longer going to take the photographic evidence of the voting rolls, which were a key part of the initial count in previous elections. We just don't know. It's interesting that there are a lot less electoral observers, international observers, than last time in an election that we know will be quite contentious and where there's a great deal of risk of voter suppression and post-electoral violence. You know, part of it is due to COVID, but the other thing is, it's not clear why the European Union was supposed to send 100 people and they're sending 6. And other, neutral observers or non-governmental observers are very, very limited in this case. And with Salvador Romero, I think it's interesting to note that he has a very close relationship with Carlos Mesa. He was personally selected by Ginny Yanez, although Mas selected other members of the electoral court. I mean, you know, that should have disqualified Agnes's candidacy. You know, that clear conflict of interest, but she stayed into the race until just recently. Salvador Romero has had electoral experience in Bolivia. He's also the head of the National Endowment for Democracy office in Honduras. And so I don't know that we can look at him as a neutral arbiter, you know, unilateral postponement in consensus with the right of elections was something that also I saw as quite problematic on the part of Salvador Romero, and there was not consensus on the electoral court of how to deal with this. Now, how the actual count will be dealt with, it's a mystery, but there are questions and concerns, and huge concerns about the OAS. I mean, I think it's interesting to note that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission came to Bolivia, had put out the first conclusive human rights report, pointed to gross human rights violations. The government signed an agreement for an expert group to come, and then the government has blocked it systematically, you know, this clarification of human rights violation. And you didn't have anyone on the international in the community calling out about that. And Almagro had now moved to illegally push out the head of the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, something that's unprecedented. But it really shows you how Bolivia is such a key litmus test for authoritarianism in these governments and a manipulation of these international institutions. And it's something we should be really quite worried about.
Yes, I think that litmus test, that testing ground, that practice ground for whether it be American militarism or various other antics. This ties into, I've got a comment here, and I think I'll tie it into concluding thoughts, but a comment here from one of the audience members said, I'm a journalist who has covered Bolivia for international outlets. I was horrified at the utter silence I received when I tried to pitch editors' stories based on interviews with survivors of the Sencada massacre in December 2019, just a couple of weeks after it happened. And they know photojournalists who found the same. So I want to sort of move this into concluding thoughts. Given the seriousness of the situation on the ground with the upcoming election, and obviously keen to offer solidarity to the people of Bolivia, Catherine and Bret, are you worried about the lack of coverage, and how can we sort of keep Bolivia in the spotlight in this critical period? Catherine.
I'm very worried about it, you know, not only in the international press, but in the Bolivian press. You just don't have information getting out. That's one of the reasons why AIN started working, because in the early 90s, there was no access to information. But things have changed, and there's a great deal of access. And you had US mainstream papers during the period around the coup really quoting, you know, the right-wing line and without any questioning. And so you have very few large-scale press outlets that are engaging in a meaningful and important way in Bolivia. And you have simultaneously the Bolivian press, you know, efforts to silence alternative press and journalists jailed, radio stations, transmissions blocked, their Facebook pages blocked. You know, the alternative voices within Bolivia are also being silenced. So it's really a struggle to get the word out. And we've also had quite a lot of trouble with Latin American human rights organizations, you know, the kind of upper echelon of human rights organizations that have failed to engage with this as a coup or recognize or respond to these, you know, very clear human rights violations. So, you know, there's a lot of concern about the manipulation of information, a lot of fake news on Facebook, a lot of bots on Twitter. Bret and I are both very well loved in right-wing social media, get a lot of attention. And so it's this whole movement of manipulation of information that should be of great concern to everyone.
Bret, do you have any suggestions?
Well, in terms of the U.S.-based press, which I know best, there's always been this kind of liberal reticence to really acknowledge the significance of the MAS government and Evo Morales in ways that weren't paternalistic, racist, condescending, and ultimately reducing Evo and the MAS to yet another populist caudillo who happened to have darker skin, which fueled into this image that's very powerful in the New York Times and Washington Post of indigenous somehow pre-modernness, even in relatively balanced accounts. The language of the U.S. media is saturated with this kind of lack of understanding. So it's not surprising that when the coup happened, that there was sort of an acceptance of the idea, oh yes, the caudillo has finally succumbed to the corruption. The US press has always been against Chavez, and now even more so against Maduro. And that's simply because of the deep connections between US capital and interests that go against what those governments were up to. So I'm a little surprised to see that the audience member saying that they got this response in outlets like Guardian and Al Jazeera as well. But at the end of the day, the disinformation machine is very, very powerful. Certainly, if the OAS says there was a fraud, you'd like to think maybe you could trust in the OAS. Turns out you can't. But once that sort of machine went into place, it was just as easy for the government to say it was a fraud, and it was Evo Morales' people who shot themselves, and it wasn't the military who was firing. So you create a breakdown of trust in all these institutions, and yeah, it took the New York Times almost a full year to say, oh yeah, well, scholars have looked at the data once again, and the OAS has manipulated it. So I think that's why we need alternative outlets like NACLA, and we all need to do what we can to get good information out there and keep the light shining on Bolivia and on the U.S. government response going forward. As a U.S. citizen, that's our job.
Thank you, Bret. One of my favorite quotes from your book is and I paraphrase here, but to highlight the resistance of the Bolivian people over hundreds of years of colonialism and their resistance in recent decades to the horrors that have been visited upon them, and yet our version of resistance is to send a tweet, but. So much respect to the Bolivian people. But Brown War Watch will be setting up an action list on our website in the coming weeks. Things especially to do if things should go awry, including contact details for your local representatives and senators, groups that you can support financially. And we'll be sure to post Catherine and Bret's Twitter information so you can receive their constant updates. Okay, well, I want to apologize to those few questions that we didn't get to. We made a good effort of it, but we've sadly run out of time. Brown War Watch and the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies at the Watson Institute would like to offer our most heartfelt thanks to our panelists today, Catherine and Bret. Thank you so much for your time and your amazing insight into the history and the situation on the ground. We wish you much continued success in your important work that you are doing. And we'd like to send our words of solidarity to the Bolivians out there struggling for their democracy. We bear witness to your struggle. We want you to know that we, the international community, are watching. So thank you to everybody, especially our audience today for tuning in, for our panelists, for CLACS for hosting this event. and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon.